So this chapter really explores the idea of how do you create a climate or an environment, a positive communication atmosphere for yourself and those around you, and also how can you identify that for others when you are entering into their communication climate. So as we always like to do, we should start off by defining what a communication climate is, right? And so it's really the social tone of a relationship. And what that means is that there are certain relationships that you feel out, that you come to know as, well, this is the person that I go to when I want to have fun. They're the party person. They're the super outgoing, bubbly, fun person, and I know that I can be that around them. And then there's other people where you feel like, I know I can go to this person for advice, and I know that when I come over to their house, things will be calm and relaxed, and we can have quiet one-on-one conversations. And so you'll see that in a variety of relationships that you have, groups that you are a part of, all of them have unique communication climates, unique kind of tones to the relationship that you have with other people. For those of you who have multiple jobs, for example, I'm sure at one job you felt a certain way, could communicate a certain way, and then when you moved to the other job, you found that it was very different, right? So even if you stay in the same field, for example, if you're a nurse at a hospital, you might be a nurse at one hospital and then at another, but you'll find that the hospitals may vary greatly in their communication climates, meaning the tone and the way that people interact with one another and talk to each other. And so as two starting examples of a communication climate, I have two clips here from The Simpsons. And so they're both related. They're both from the same episode. And you can see here that in both of these clips, Homer Simpson, who definitely hates his neighbor, Ned Flanders, has to go on a camping trip with Ned Flanders along with his son, Bart, and Ned Flanders' son. And because Homer has a very negative attitude, the types of communication behaviors he engages in usually involve sarcasm, really defensive, aggressive, nonverbal behaviors, and he tends to put down Ned Flanders and not acknowledge a lot of the good ideas that he has or acknowledge Ned Flanders as a person. And you can kind of see the result of that in how other people react in this camping trip and how they deal with Homer's negative attitude. And so this climate is something that is definitely shared by all people involved. And so I recommend that you watch these two clips and focus on how Homer's behaviors not only reflect his promotion of a negative communication climate, but also how other people are impacted by his communication behaviors, which as competent communicators, that's what we're also worried about, right? So how do communication climates develop, also known as CCs? Here, I just abbreviated it because typing out communication climate is a lot of syllables. So CCs develop by the degree to which people see themselves as valued. You might find, again, back to my job example, that you're at one job and you feel like your manager or your boss really values you, really trusts you, really acknowledges, appreciates, and thanks you for your work. And you might go to another job where you feel like your boss doesn't really care that you've worked really hard or that you've tried really hard to accomplish your job in the most efficient way, because they are not engaging in communication behaviors like acknowledging you, thanking you, and all of that to create this positive confirming communication. And so one of the key things here is that communicating to others, whether or not you value them, does not happen overnight, as you might assume. And so really how we first start building CCs is we start building what we call climate patterns. And you see that here in the black words right there. We build communication patterns, and then those patterns become the building blocks of the communication climate. And so let's talk about those climate patterns first, and then we'll talk about how we use these patterns as the building blocks for communication climates, okay? So the first type of communication pattern I want to talk about is confirming communication. And confirming communication is very important to building a positive, strong communication climate. And so if someone uses confirming communication a lot, they're building a very positive climate pattern, which ultimately builds a very positive communication climate, or CC. And so confirming communication really means when you're using messages or communicating in a way to tell other people, show other people that you value them, you value their contributions, you value who they are, and you value their ideas. And so there's different levels of how we can do this. And you can see here that I put the different levels in different colors. And one of the things that I want you to do is read this from top to bottom, so it's a little easier so you can see the different levels of confirming communication. So the first type is recognition, and this is the most fundamental baseline type of confirming communication. What recognition refers to is simply greeting someone else, calling them by their name, learning their name, and recognizing them as a human being. One example of how we do this on a regular basis, and we're not even aware that we do it, is when someone walks into a room, we say hi to them, right? So here's an example. Let's say you're at home, you're watching Netflix, you're on your couch, you're enjoying your day, and your grandma comes over to visit. Imagine if your grandma walks through the door to visit you or your family, and you just continue watching Netflix and you never say hi to her. That's incredibly rude, right? By saying hi to her, by engaging in that communication behavior, you are engaging in a form of recognition. You're saying, hi, grandma, I'm recognizing the other person. You might even stand up non-verbally, hugging her, giving her a kiss on her cheek, in addition to the verbal recognition as well. And so recognition is so important. We do it all the time, and it's easier to recognize how important recognition is, not just by what happens when you do it, but by what happens when you don't do it. So imagine, again, if you didn't say hi to your grandma, if you walked into work and you didn't greet your fellow coworkers, right? If you came home and you didn't even say hi to your significant other that you live with. And so recognition is so important because what it does is it tells the other person, I recognize you as an individual, as a person. The next level of that is acknowledging. This is when we have taken the time to hear someone else's ideas, their feelings, and you are recognizing that, hey, I've heard what you've had to say. I have acknowledged the messages that you have given me. This is typically when people self-disclose to us, or they share to us about their day, or they communicate other messages to us. When we engage in acknowledgement, this is when we recognize, hey, I've heard you, and I've taken in your message, and I've taken the time to listen to your message and take it seriously. And the next level to that is endorsement. And this is when you say, hey, I not only hear your opinions and hear your ideas, but I also agree with them. So remember that in that blue word right there, acknowledgement, you can acknowledge another person's ideas. That doesn't necessarily mean you agree with them. Endorsement is that next level of confirming communication where you say, hey, you know what? That is a good idea. Hey, you know what? That would be a better way to do this. And so you are telling the speaker that you are confirming their goodness of their idea. And so these are 3 levels of confirming communication. Ultimately, what we're looking to do, especially if we are in positions of leadership, which I'm sure all of you will be one day if you aren't already, is to engage in repeated patterns of confirming communication with the people that you are working with and around. This also is great for communicating within your family members as well. Not only taking the time to recognize family members when they come to visit you, when they come to see you, but also acknowledging their ideas, acknowledging what they have to say, and at times when it's appropriate, endorsing or agreeing with the messages that they are sending. If we continuously engage in these types of confirming communication behaviors, we create a more positive confirming pattern, as I talked about, and those patterns ultimately become the building blocks for our overall communication climate. So that was confirming communication. And now let's talk about the next level, which is disagreeing messages. And so disagreeing messages are types of messages that are both disconfirming and confirming. I know this is a little confusing, so just bear with me as I kind of tease this idea out. And then I will also go on to talk about disconfirming messages, compare the track and contrast the two so you can kind of see the difference. But just like with confirming messages, there are levels to disagreeing messages. You can see them here starting with this orange word all the way down to the red word. And so read it just the same exact way as you read the confirming messages one, where you read top to bottom, the top being the most basic level of disagreeing and the bottom being the most in-depth, complex form of disagreeing. And so really what you're doing when you are engaging in disagreeing messages is that you're telling the other person, hey, I have listen to what you've had to say, right? So I am confirming you, I'm valuing you as a human being. I've taken the time to listen to you, but I just don't agree with you. And so we express our disagreement through three major ways. The first is argumentativeness, and I'm only going to say that once because that's a lot of syllables. And so this is when we are presenting and defending our opinions about things that people just said. In turn, of course, we have to put down the opinions that we just heard from the other person and then bolster up our own opinion. And we do this quite often, actually, with our friends, our family, our coworkers. Sometimes they'll say something that we just disagree with, and we'll share with them, well, I kind of see what you have to say about that, but here's my point of view. This is where I see it, and this is why I think your idea is kind of lacking or incorrect. And so even with people that we love and respect, we do engage in argumentativeness more often than we think, even though the word itself sounds very negative, right? The next level of that is complaining, and any of you who work in any type of food service or retail you know what complaining looks like. And so this is when you are not arguing with the other person. You're not actually wanting to bring them into the conversation. You just want to complain. You just want to have your displeasure heard, right? Your dissatisfaction heard, and you want to express it, but you're not really looking for them to argue with you. You'll see, like I said, if you are in retail, customer service, food service, customers who engage in complaints aren't necessarily looking for you to get in on the conversation with them. They just want to complain and feel like their complaint is valid and heard, right? And so think of it in that term where that complaining has to be there. Aggressiveness is the last level, and this is a very destructive way where we try to disagree with other people, but in so doing, instead of just attacking their ideas, as we would here in argumentativeness, in aggressiveness, what we're doing is we're attacking their self-concept. We're attacking who they are as people. We're calling them maybe words like stupid or dumb or worthless or trash or whatever word we might call them to attack their self-concept. And really what we're doing is we're trying to win. We're trying to show them like, I'm better than you, my ideas are better than you, and your ideas suck, and you also suck at the same time. So aggressiveness is that lower, deeper level because I'm not, like I said, again, not just attacking your ideas, but I'm attacking who you are, your self-concept, and who you are as a person. And so now that we've covered disagreeing messages, I want to go on and cover disconfirming messages and talk about how they're different between confirming, disagreeing, and disconfirming. Again, these are the three levels that we are concerned about today in COMSTD 4. So first level, disconfirming communication really is something that we want to avoid. So like I said in my previous slide about disagreeing messages, you can love and adore and respect someone and still engage in argumentativeness with them, for example, right? You can still disagree with them because disagreement still does involve some type of confirmation, right? I've heard your idea, so I confirm that I've heard it, I acknowledge it, I just don't agree with it. But in disconfirming communication, we take that aspect out of it, where we're no longer even hearing the person's ideas, we're just dismissing their value and their ideas as a whole. And so there are 7 different types of disconfirming responses that I'll cover right now. So the first is an impervious response. This is when you just ignore the other person. You don't want to acknowledge the fact that they're trying to talk to you. So this could be the opposite, right, of acknowledgement, as we talked about in confirming messages. Instead of returning someone's greeting, if they say, hey, how are you? And you just decide to not even say hi back, that's an impervious response. That's not recognizing them as a person, right? I'm not even going to take the time to say hi to you. As Cardi B would say, if I see you and I don't speak, that means I'm giving you disconfirming communication. I'm pretty sure that's how she raps it, right? Interrupting responses. I'm sure you've all been privy to this and also engaged in this, where you interrupt the other person before they're finished making their points, right? Really what you're saying is, I get what you're saying, but what I have to say is a little bit more important right now, so I'm going to stop you. So that's why it's a level of disconfirming communication, because you're not letting the other person complete their idea. Irrelevant responses is when you say something that has nothing to do with what the person just said. So you heard what they have to say, you don't really care about it, and now you want to respond by changing the story, changing the topic, or talking about something that is more important to you than whatever it is that they just said. Moving right along. We have tangential responses. This is when I acknowledge what you just said, but then I'm going to use what you just said to bring up another topic that I want to talk about. I know actually this can sound quite similar to irrelevant responses, but remember, irrelevant responses means I'm totally doing a 180. I'm completely changing the subject. You're talking about bananas. I'm talking about the moon, right? We're not even talking about anything remotely related. Tangential responses are when I am talking about something related to what you said, but I'm steering the discussion to the direction I want it to go into. So, for example, the other day I was discussing tattoos with a friend, and I was discussing just getting a tattoo and the experience of getting one and what it must be like because I don't have one. And this friend was listening to me, but then kind of steering the direction toward getting me to discuss why tattoos are bad, right? Because she's not a huge fan of tattoos. She doesn't like them. She doesn't like people that have them. And so she very much was like, well, why are you even considering getting a tattoo? You know, the fact that you're even considering it, you know, it's just crazy to me. And so here I am talking about, it must be what a cool experience to get a tattoo. I'm interested in the whole idea of tattoos. It was just National Tattoo Day a couple days ago, I believe. And I was just interested in that process, right? Historically, of how people have chosen their design, chosen how to get it, because you know, nowadays we get it using, you know, the technology of needles, but way back in the day, people didn't have that. So I was just interested in the history of it and discussing it with her and talking about how I watched a Netflix documentary about it. And what she was doing was redirecting my tattoo discussion to, well, you shouldn't even be thinking about tattoos because they're bad. Does that make sense? So we're still talking about tattoos as a subject, but she's clearly steering it in a different direction. And that is different from an irrelevant response. If she had brought up dogs in the middle of my tattoo conversation, that's an irrelevant response. But what she did was a tangential response. So just to clarify that. Impersonal responses, you have all been victims of this, where you say something and then someone gives you this huge Shakespearean beautiful monologue that they have to talk about, where they want to share about their opinions and their ideas and what's important to them. These people generally never interact with you on a personal level. They talk about these very high theoretical abstract ideas, and they never actually get to know you as a person. And I'm sure that you have experienced these types where maybe you might seek advice from a friend, and instead of giving you advice that would work for you, your friend is like, oh my god, like, I mean, you're struggling with your relationship with your boyfriend, but what even are relationships? You know, like, do we even need relationships? When I think about it, you know, relationships are just kind of just a waste of time, you know. So they've kind of take it in this bigger, wider, macro direction that you're not looking for. And the key thing is here is that they never interact with you as a human being. So they never really take the time to ask you about how you feel about something or what your opinion is about something. They just take it in this very impersonal, intellectualized, they share all the stuff they know about it. Another example I can give you is I have a friend of mine who's really into makeup, and I like makeup too. I wear it pretty often, if not every day. And I was talking to her about different makeup brands that I wanted to try and get into. And I said, well, one of the biggest things I have is, you know, I have kind of a rounder face, so I want to see, like, if there's anything I can do to, like, make it not look so round and so baby-ish. And so immediately what she started doing was talking about all her makeup knowledge and all the makeup she knows. And instead of addressing my question of how can I get makeup that fits me and my needs and like what I want, you know, because not all makeup is for everybody, you know, we all look different. She started talking about, you know, these ideas about makeup and different brands and what they stand for. And I'm like, girl, like, I need to know all that. I just needed to know your suggestion for what can make this look not like a 12-year-old. And so impersonal responses can be very frustrating because you're sitting there looking for that person to acknowledge you in a certain way, and they're not. Ambiguous responses is when a message contains more than one meaning. This is usually because of sarcasm. Sarcasm is a fantastic example of an ambiguous response because someone says something verbally, but then obviously non-verbally they're meaning something else when they're being sarcastic. And it also can refer to when your messages are just verbally phrased a little oddly, and so, you know, your receiver doesn't really know how to decode it properly. And I'm sure you've all been victim of people, especially on social media, that kind of give these weird sarcastic or passive aggressive comments. And so there's multiple ways you can absorb their messages and you don't know which is the correct way to decode it. And that can be really frustrating. And the last one is incongruous responses. And these are messages that have two messages that actually contradict one another, one at the verbal level, one at the nonverbal level. The key example of an incongruous response is when you ask someone, hey, are you okay? Is everything okay? And they're like, I'm fine. So verbally, they're saying, I'm fine. Non-verbally, the I'm fine, that tone of voice, the nonverbal, all tells us they're not doing fine, right? And so it kind of leaves you as the receiver of that message in this weird space where you're like, do you want me to bring this up? Do you not want me to talk about this? Are you looking to vent? Are you not looking to vent? Like, what do I do, you know? So you're kind of lost. And really what that does is it puts up a wall between you and that person. And that person, by having that incongruous response, is not confirming your desire to ask about them or help them in that moment. And so we get kind of these contradicting messages from people, and as receivers, we're like, okay, what do we do about that? And ultimately, what happens is that kind of ends the conversation quite quickly. Yes. Ooh. All right. So next up, defensiveness. You guys have heard about defensiveness, and this is something that we definitely, all competent communicators have to work on to make sure that we do not engage in ways where we are becoming hostile because of our defensiveness. And ultimately, I would say that the hostility not only comes from ourselves, but we become triggered, right, by certain things. We talked about this in chapter 8 when we talked about emotions, and we talked about that rational emotive approach, right, using our mind to interrupt our different emotional responses. And that can be really hard when we are getting our activating event or our triggering that is making us feel that there's some hostility going on, right? And so a couple of things I want to say about defensiveness here that I think are really helpful for us definition-wise to understand moving forward so that we can try to avoid being defensive as much as possible. So the first thing I want you to recognize is that this is throwback to chapter 3. If this sounds familiar, our presenting self is so important. So our presenting self is all the messages you want to show the rest of the world, right? It's your presentation of who you want to be, who you want to show to the world. And oftentimes our face, as part of that, becomes threatened by other people who do not want to acknowledge our presenting self or our true selves. And so because of that, they are engaging in what we call face-threatening acts. You can see that there in the pink. This is anytime someone kind of challenges the image, you know, that presenting self that we want to give out to the rest of the world. And that can be really hard for us, and that usually is what kind of dips us into defensiveness, because remember what we talked about in chapter 3, the self-concept is very, very fragile at times. It likes to see itself replicated, and most importantly, it likes to see itself validated. And so, of course, it makes sense that we would become defensive and protective of ourself if we perceive ourself getting attacked, right? Getting challenged. And so that's where the defensiveness mechanism comes from. And so as communicators, it's really good that we recognize this definition so that when we do feel ourselves becoming defensive and wanting to snap back and become hostile towards someone else that we perceive as being hostile towards us, to recognize that, hey, this hostility or this need for defensiveness is really coming from my natural habit to defend my sense of self, right? And kind of stepping back and remembering that really helps us reduce our defensiveness and ultimately promote a more supportive climate. Now, that's what we can do for ourselves, right? But remember, as competent communicators, one of the key things we need to remember is that in order to be competent communicators, we not only have to know how to manage our own communication skills, behaviors, where it's effective and appropriate for any given situation, we also need to communicate in ways that set up others to be as successful as they can be in that communication interaction. So I just talked about how we can make sure to try to reduce our defensive habits, right, and not be defensive ourselves, how can we communicate in a way where we don't encourage, spark, or promote defensiveness in other people? And the way we do that is by having a stronger understanding of Gibbs categories. And you'll see in your textbook that they spend a very long time on Gibbs categories, as they should, because Gibbs categories is a set of categories that helps us understand what types of comments will encourage defensiveness and what types of comments will reduce defensiveness from other people. And ultimately, what we want to do is be on the side that reduces that defensiveness, right? And so let me go ahead and go through the categories. I'll review them really quickly. And I think they're just really good tools that we can use in our family life, our work life, our personal relationships to have those really tough conversations we need to have with people and try to set them up to be successful by not phrasing our words in a way that encourage defensiveness from them. All right, so the first category is evaluation versus description. You can see that there in the teal color. And this category really deals with, is our communication focused on judging the other person, or is it focused on offering your thoughts and your feelings free of judgment? And I think that's really hard for us, especially when we are having very serious conversations with people that we love. We get really emotionally invested. And so our communication isn't as under much scrutiny because we're emotional, we're invested in the situation. And as a result, because of that, we might say things or phrase things in ways that are not careful and then might involve a lot of judgment of the other person. And so what we want to do is strive for a climate where when someone comes to us with a problem, if they come to us with an idea or an opinion, we listen and we offer them thoughts and feelings of the idea, the advice, the message, and not judgment of them as people. And so that's really important. And that's why this category is called evaluation versus description. You want to end up describing your thoughts and your feelings without evaluating who they are as a person, right? So if a friend of mine comes to me about a problem that she's having, instead of telling her, oh my gosh, you're so stupid, why did you do that? I can't believe that you did that. What were you thinking? Those are evaluative statements where I'm pretty much judging her for being stupid or dumb, and I'm communicating in a way that's going to get her to be defensive, right? She might respond with, whoa, like, hey, I'm coming to you with this advice. Don't, call me stupid, or don't be like, oh, what were you thinking? And that obviously won't lead to a very positive conversation. So what I want to do instead of that is engage in description, which is where I start saying things like, okay, well, from what I heard about the problem that you just communicated to me, I really feel like this is a very serious situation that requires you to be very careful and to be very focused. And I think the best way to do that would be to do X, Y, and Z, right? So I'm offering her advice. I'm offering her my thoughts and feelings about the situation that she's in, and the details of the situation and the details of my advice, and I'm not evaluating her as a person. Does that make sense? Really important that we do that. Moving on to our next category, controlling communication versus problem orientation. This is when you are engaging in controlling communication, what you're doing is you're trying to force a solution or force that other person to think, well, this is the right way to do it and you need to do it my way. And I think for those of you who have jobs or multiple jobs at work, you've probably met a coworker or a supervisor or a boss or a manager who has engaged in controlling communication with you, right? Where maybe you make a mistake or maybe you don't do things the way they specifically want them to be done. And instead of helping you, right, to fix the problem, fix your mistake, or do your job better, they come at you with, well, why didn't you do it this way? I want you to do it this way. And next time it better be done this way. That's what we call controlling communication. When people engage in that type of communication, not only will it make you obviously very defensive because you're on the receiving end of it, what it also communicates is that that person cares more about that you're doing it their way instead of the fact that you're just trying to do it, right? They're much more focused on having power and and control over you rather than helping you and guiding you in doing things correctly. So what we need to do is engage in problem orientation, where instead of focusing on how dare you not do it the way I asked you to do it, I focus on, well, okay, this wasn't done, in the way, or the best way possible. Let's kind of work on solutions and strategies and skills that we can do to help you do it right the next time. And so in my communication, I'm focused on skills and strategies that I want to share with you rather than kind of banging into you like, well, you need to do it my way. And there's a big difference between those two. One key thing that I actually, as a personal example, learned a lot when I go on professional development or when I go to workshops and learn about how to interact with my students, interact with my fellow peers and faculty members, is to always engage in problem orientation and not controlling communication. So for example, if a student is struggling with an assignment and comes to me with a draft of their essay, if I engaged in controlling communication, I might say things like, you need to read the instructions, you need to do it this way, otherwise you won't get points. And in that scenario, I'm not only going to make them defensive, but I'm also not really helping them, right? But if I engage in problems orientation and I sit down with the student and I say, well, okay, your essay as it is written right now isn't, at the best draft it could be. Let's look at different strategies and ways I can help you kind of get the essay to where it needs to be. And instead of listing off things I want them to do, I'm giving them tools and strategies to help guide them toward producing a stronger or better essay or analysis. And so it's really important that we kind of have a good understanding of controlling people versus focusing on solving the problem. More Gibbs categories. So strategy versus spontaneity. I think this pairs actually quite well with problem versus controlling orientation. And so strategy is when you are trying to make someone else do something not only let me revert that. You are speaking in a way to promote your own agenda and not really support another person. Whereas spontaneity is being honest with other people. Here's a key example. So let us say that you are really upset with one of your very, very, very close friends or romantic partner. And anytime we're in a conflict with someone we care about, it's really hard to bring it up. Would you guys agree? It's really hard to sit down with them and have really tough conversations about how they hurt us, how they made us angry, how they disappointed us. Those are really difficult things to talk about. And what people tend to do, because in that moment they're feeling that hurt, that disappointment, that anger, those emotions bubble up and they become strategic rather than spontaneous. What that means is we start communicating in a way where we become passive aggressive. Maybe we start sharing with them like, don't you know that you hurt me and that you disappointed me? And so of course, when you communicate in that way, you're going to spark defensiveness in that person, because in that moment, your agenda is, I want you to know how much you hurt me, right? You're strategizing your communication to the point where I just want them to know how much they hurt me. This is the point that I'm trying to make. Rather with spontaneity, if you sit down and tell that person, hey, the other day when you made this comment, I know you meant it as a joke, but it was really hurtful for me, and I just wanted to share that with you, right? So instead of making them feel bad for hurting you, you're just letting them know, look, like I want to share with you what happened and engage with you in this conversation rather than manipulating them and making them feel bad, right, for whatever it is that they did wrong to you. And so it's about being honest with your feelings, your emotions, with other people, rather than trying to hide your emotions and feelings and masking it by having these very jabby, short, aggressive comments that you typically see with strategy. Next one is neutrality versus empathy. And this is when people choose to stay neutral or like not having an opinion rather than being empathetic and caring. And so ultimately why that is important for us is that we have to remember that first and foremost, neutrality is never helpful for people. When you are going to someone and seeking advice from them, going to them to just vent, going to them to just share something about how you're feeling or what you're experiencing, you never want that person to be neutral, right? You never want them to just not care about what you're saying. You want them to have some sort of an opinion, because by having an opinion, what they're doing is taking the time to acknowledge what you say and taking the time to respond to it. And so empathy has been a huge theme of this class, and empathy is always kind of the better choice, the better go-to. Instead of being just neutral about everything, be empathetic. Here's an example. So let's say this is actually an experience that I've had. When I was growing up, I had what we call in communication studies a non-normative name, meaning that my name was my natural-born Vietnamese name. I didn't have my Americanized Ava name yet, and so it was really difficult at times for teachers or students to say my name. And I remember that, and so for me personally, it's always very important for me to make sure I pronounce all my students' names correctly every single time, because I remember what it's like being a student and having your teacher not only struggle to say your name, but not even care to say your name correctly, right? So I was talking to a friend about that, and I was sharing with them how important it is for teachers to say their students' names right. And I shared my personal experience, as I just did. And the person responded to me by saying, "Who cares? It's just a name." That's an example of a neutral response. So to them, maybe it might not matter, but to me, I just explained to you why it mattered to me, right? So I need you to be empathetic in this moment, not neutral. For you, yeah, maybe it's just a name, and maybe at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right? If my 6th grade teacher could say my name right or not. But when I'm experiencing these feelings and sharing them, I really want to hear from that person to be like, wow, that must be kind of hard to just have a name that people can't say or struggle saying, make fun of you for, or whatever, right? And so empathy could have been more helpful in that situation than neutrality, because all that comment made me feel was that my feelings were stupid, that I felt dumb for feeling that way, and that also I felt that I couldn't talk to this person anymore about this kind of topic or this conversation. Ultimately, it also made me feel like I probably shouldn't come to this person to talk to them about these kind of issues at all, right? And so it's really important that we, even if it's something that's not a big deal to us, to not just I don't care, it's not a big deal to me, to try to be empathetic to that person, to the other person that we're listening to. Superiority versus equality. You've all been also victims of this, where superiority messages are messages that communicate, I'm better than you, you're not as good as I am at this or that, whereas equality is about communicating to others that while I might be good at this, I know you're also someone who's talented in different fields, in different areas. And so really what equality does is sharing with other people that they have just as much worth as someone else. One example of this was actually recently I was volunteering at a food bank, where this food bank was all about packaging food and also serving breakfast to individuals who are homeless. And so when they opened the doors on the weekend, it was Sunday morning, I was there with a bunch of other volunteers getting the food ready, and the homeless individuals come in to be served their Sunday brunch, as it is. And I heard someone saying comments to the other person because one of the homeless individuals asked for seconds, and the volunteer that was asked for seconds responded with a superiority comment where they said, well, I know you want to have seconds because you're homeless, but I can't just give everybody seconds, because then we wouldn't have enough for everybody. And I was really kind of shocked by that comment. It definitely had this superiority. And even though, the person was right, we were not permitted to give seconds, because they're right. We wouldn't have enough for everybody if we gave some people seconds. That's not the way to go through that, right? That's not the way to communicate that. The better way to communicate that would have been, oh, I'm so sorry, unfortunately, I can't give you seconds. But definitely if there is extra, please come find me and I'll be happy to give it to you once we've served everybody, right? So there's a big difference between communicating the content of, no, I'm sorry, I can't give you any, in a superiority way versus an equality way. Because when I apologize to the person, I say, I'm so sorry, please, I can't give you seconds because I won't have enough for everybody. What I'm telling you is, I wish I could, so I see the value in you as a human being, but because of these constraints, I can't. Versus that person's comment was definitely not acknowledging the value of that other human being, of that other person. Certainty versus provisionalism. This is when someone are so sure that they're right, that they have the best solution, the best ideas, the best advice, and they are unwilling to hear anyone else's opinions, ideas, or advice. And so individuals who practice certainty a lot usually get other people to be defensive because the world is big. There's lots of knowledge out there. There's lots of things going on. Times change. It's very unlikely that we can have the right answer to everything all the time, right? If anything, I would say that we're probably more wrong about a lot of things than we are right. And so to counteract that, what we want to engage in are communication behaviors that are about provisionalism, where you hold on to your strong opinions. It's not like you let them go, but you're willing to also admit that there's other realities, other truths, other pieces of knowledge out there that you're not aware of that could also be right. And so you practice that provisionalism where you know, like, hey, I have a really strong opinion about this, but I know that I don't hold, I'm not the king of all the truth and all the knowledge. I definitely understand that there are other opinions out there that are just as valid as mine. And these are people, as we talked about in chapter 8, I really want to connect these chapters now, that usually have a higher EQ are the ones that practice provisionalism the best. We find that individuals, obviously, who have a better understanding of their emotional intelligence are more likely to, and find it easier to practice provisionalism, where they're able to see other points of view and not be stubborn and hold on to only what they perceive to be their correct opinion about something. All right. So one of the things, now that we've covered Gibbs categories, is to engage in what we call invitational communication. And it is exactly what the title says it is. You are inviting others to see your point of view and freely share their point of view. I love the word invite because think of it as like inviting someone to a party, right? They have the right to say no, and if they come, then that's great. So think of your communication as trying to be as inviting and welcoming as possible. We are not forcing anyone into your point of view or your way of thinking and the direction you want the conversation to go into. Rather, you're just inviting them to join you, right? And so the first thing is that you want to do is describe choices instead of obligations. Oftentimes in interpersonal conflicts, unfortunately, what we see happen is people say, well, you need to do this, or I'm not going to be your friend anymore. Or if you do this, then I don't know if we can be in this relationship anymore. And so people engage in comments where we obligate other people, like we require other people to do things, rather than offer them up choices, right? And so what we want to do as competent communicators is also be invitational communicators, where we provide others the freedom to choose, right? And one of the things we need to do, we need to remember on the tail end of that is be okay with criticism. If you invite others into your communication interaction, invite them to share their opinions, their ideas, you also have to be okay on the flip side with dealing with their criticism, their responses as well. And so one of the things you can do for dealing with criticism, because like I said earlier, the self-concept usually gets tangled up in there. It really likes to see itself validated, replicated. And so at times our self-concept can't quite handle that criticism. What can we do in order to counteract that? We can ask for specifics, we can guess about the specifics, or we can paraphrase. I'm not going to go through paraphrasing a lot because we did that in chapter 4 when we talked about perception checking. But remember, it's all about using I language, making sure to recognize what the other person said, give them a summary so that you invite them to correct you if you are wrong. You guess about the specifics, so you encourage the other person by saying, hey, I think this is what you're saying. Is this right? You didn't mention this, so I assume you mean this. You're just guessing, but you're trying to let them know, hey, I really want to know more about the details of what you're saying in your message. Or you can ask very directly about the specifics as well. And these are 3 different strategies to respond to criticism. When you are receiving criticism from your family members, from your boss, so let's say, for example, your boss writes in your employee report that, they didn't really like how you did a certain task, you can ask for specifics. What was it that you didn't like? You can guess and say, hey, I think this was one thing that you didn't like, I think, right? And so we can engage in these types of ways where we can feel empowered to do something about the criticism we're receiving, rather than just receiving criticism and then feeling bad about it, right? And choice is really important in all of that, where we invite other people to criticize us in a healthy and productive way, and also invite them to clarify their criticisms for us. And ideally, when we provide criticism, people will do this to us as well. And that's all about setting up a positive communication climate that allows people to feel like, hey, if Miss Wynn does, critique my essay, I feel like I can come up to her and talk to her about it, that kind of thing. So moving right along to the tail end of this wonderful lecture. Criticism, continuing with our conversation about criticism, you can also, instead of questioning the criticism, agree with it. You can say, yeah, you're right, I did not do a good job on that. But you're just letting that other person know in varying ways that either, yeah, you're totally right, or yeah, you're right, I technically shouldn't have done that. In principle, right, maybe not the best idea. But you also are like, I'm not going to change my idea. So, agreeing in principle simply means that you are able to understand where they're coming from, why they didn't like what you did or said, but at the same time, because you share different principles, I'm going to still continue acting the way I did. And so, in addition to that, that is the end of our communication climate. So let me quick summarize what we learned today. So we talked about a communication climate. Communication climate is basically the product of repeated communication patterns that deal with how people feel valued, the extent to which they feel valued in any given communication interaction. And so what that does for us as communicators is helps us recognize, okay, if I want to build a positive communication climate where people feel valued, what do I do? And so that's why we covered confirming, disagreeing, and disconfirming messages, where we looked at the varying different types of concrete communication behaviors we can engage in to either in a healthy way disagree with someone or confirm someone. And then we also talked about disconfirming messages that we should try to avoid when possible, because if we have too many disconfirming messages, we create a pattern of communication that ultimately, remember, patterns are the building blocks of our climates. If we have a couple negative building blocks, then we end up with a climate that is not conducive to that value and that trust that we want. We then talked about, very importantly, Gibbs Categories, where we talked about what are the strategies I can do to empower myself as a communicator to make sure I'm not making other people defensive with the comments that I'm making, with the messages I'm trying to send across. We talked about the differences between defense provoking, meaning a message that makes you defensive, and supportive messages that are not making other people defensive in the Gibbs categories. And then finally, we talked about criticism, responding to criticism, responding to it in a healthy and productive way. And that wraps up not only this chapter, but the rest of the course. And so we've learned so much, and I think you really see it play out here in communication climate. You can see that I reference a lot of chapters throughout this lecture. I referenced chapter 8, I referenced chapter 3. All of this has to do with chapter 1, which is the communication model about interactions back and forth. And so you'll see that this is a great chapter to end on, because I think it does such a great job of wrapping up how to